Hello and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and this episode marks a bit of a milestone. I've actually got two new exciting additions to the podcast. The first is that we have a bit of a partner. If you didn't listen to episode 20 of the show with Alex Martel, then you wouldn't have learned about the fantastic wine app, which is for iPhone, called Vinous. So basically, Vinous is designed for the wine lover who wants to keep track of the wines that they've tasted, log them, make comments, make a rating, but also to then share them with their network. So it's a really fantastic way for you to hook in with other wine lovers. You can link it to such fantastic social media platforms as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as well. Venice is also a fantastic way to find real-time information about where you can buy wines you may be interested in or you might want to buy again, but also it's got relevant information about what you could expect to pay for it. So Venice is basically for Australian and New Zealand users only, so you're going to be connecting with other wine lovers in those two countries and looking at wines that are available, which is fantastic. So I do suggest going to getvinous.com/Vincast, and that way you can find out more and download the app for the iPhone. And if you're going to use it, I do encourage you to follow me and many of the other featured users on that app. The other really fantastic addition to the podcast is I've actually managed to finally work out how to record episodes using Skype, which means that I'll be able to start talking to some international guests. And for the first opportunity, I could not have asked for a better guest than Mr. Matthew Jukes, who is joining me all the way from London. And he's going to talk a little bit about himself, but also the fantastic wine-based charity event that is run locally here in Melbourne called Wine Rules. So thank you for joining me today, Matthew, all the way from... Well, how is the weather in London today?
It's pretty rainy, to be honest.
Oh, what a shock.
Yeah.
So Matthew, for those of my listeners who may not be familiar with you, just if you wouldn't mind, tell me a little bit about your background, how you came into wine that led you on the path to do what you do now.
Yeah, it's pretty long story that needs to be cut short for fear of boring your followers.
No, I'm sure
I
they can find out more information online anyway.
I started, golly, a long time ago, nearly 28 years ago, working in a little wine shop in London, a little independent wine shop.
Yeah.
I flunked out of a physics degree.
Okay.
I didn't fancy that, bit too difficult, and so I went to work in a wine shop, and I happened to, by fluke, choose a really good wine shop.
Yeah.
And that was it, really. Bitten by the bug and just tasted everything I saw and haven't stopped since.
And were you sort of really interested in wine communicating and wine assessing pretty early on? Did you kind of, from an early stage, sort of keep notes about wines you were tasting?
Yeah, very much. I didn't have much of a choice. The chap that owned the shop at the time, whose name I won't divulge, was moderately lazy. Let's put it that way. So
Right.
he rather thrust me into the limelight whenever he could.
Okay.
And that involved doing lots of tastings and public sort of events for our customers. So, age 19, I was center stage, pouring wine and having to explain it and this, that, and the other. And I just found it sort of fairly easy. For me, it was a case of I didn't really need to know an awful lot about the wine itself or who made it. I just needed to sort of describe what it tasted like and kind of what it did to me. And
Yeah.
And that's very much the sort of secret that I think I have, because it's not really the technical side of things that customers are often interested in. It's what the wine does to you and what you would drink it with and who you should pour it with, and there's kind of rather more ethereal to rather more romantic things, really.
Yeah, absolutely. What point did you sort of start actually looking at the sort of the journalism writing side of things?
Yeah, that was that was kind of halfway through. I still regard myself very much as a member of the wine trade rather than a journalist,
Yeah. Okay.
because I still work full time as a wine buyer. I juggle lots of different jobs, and the one that I'm more, well known for is the writing side, obviously.
Sure.
But it's certainly not how I derive my income. I wouldn't be able to afford to just work as a journalist, I'm afraid, these days. And so the crossover moment kind of came when I did a radio show on the BBC for about 4 years, a weekly wine sort of slot on a very popular FM station in London called GLR, which is now defunct. It was a BBC station.
Yep.
And that got masses of listeners. And on the back of that, I was offered a TV series
Oh wow.
on Channel 4. So this is 15 years ago. So pretty much halfway through my career.
Yep.
And I jumped at the chance to do that, obviously. That went down very well. And on the back of that, it's a kind of domino toppling thing that happened. I was offered a book, kind of, would I like to write a book? And being a fairly sort of failed English student at school, I was rather daunted by the idea of writing a book. And I just wrote it in the way that I speak.
Sure.
And of course, that made it quite easy for people to understand. And the book did extremely well. And the Daily Mail on the back of that serialized the book. And they had a load of letters into the Daily Mail, which is over here is the biggest read sort of newspaper and wine column. And they decided to make me their wine writer. And that was 15 years ago.
And you continue to write for the Daily Mail today?
Yeah, every weekend for 15 years. And so it was fluke. It was complete fluke. It just came from me talking about wine, in a rather animated fashion. And then very, very quickly, I was writing for the Daily Mail, and of course, I would never let that job go willingly. And since then, I've written 14 wine books and done all the rest of my writing that you'll be familiar with.
Sure. Initially, when you were sort of writing for the Daily Mail, was it kind of opinion pieces, or were you reviewing wines, or was it just a combination of different things?
This is a really it's a really strict kind of differentiation between what I would call traditional wine journalists and me as a wine writer.
Yeah.
I'm not a critic in that I don't criticize or critique wines.
Sure.
I recommend wines. So I'm very much a wine recommender. So
Okay.
in my column in the Mail, there's only 6 slots to fill with wines. And in my column in Money Week, which is a magazine, a weekly magazine, quite a sort of serious financial magazine every week here, there's only room for 1 wine. And tasting 40 odd thousand bottles a year with only 7 slots a week, it's a recommending column. There's no room to write about wines that I hate.
Sure.
Why would I?
And do you feel it's important to kind of encourage the reader or listener, viewer, whatever the medium, to kind of discover things for themselves? So you're sort of almost setting them on a path of their own?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much in the tasting notes. I'm trying to give them the tools with which to experiment with a wine style, with my recommended wine as the kind of model, let's say.
Okay.
And that's developed into clearly a lot more wine writing, and the books and stuff are informative and educative, hopefully. But on my website, I think that's probably where I do most of my actual traditional kind of journo stuff. So big articles on Bordeaux en primeur or Burgundy en primeur or whatever, where there is criticism and real insight. But from the public persona, I'm just a recommender, and hopefully a little bit like I suppose it's unlike a film critic who has to say whether they give it 5 stars or it's a turkey.
Yeah.
I'm hopefully seen as the guy who's never going to let you down in the newspaper.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the books, obviously there's been quite a few, and they've all taken sort of different forms.
Yeah.
That's kind of almost a case by case basis what the kind of the nature of the book is.
Yeah. The books, most of them, so 10 of them have been purely these sort of recommending annual Christmas kind of, the book you get in your Christmas stocking that tells you the best wines to go out and buy.
Yeah.
So I wrote 7 of those in the UK and 3 in Australia, which thankfully did extremely well.
Yeah.
And then the other books are more wine course, or my latest book is the 100 most iconic wine estates of the world. So that's a more of a creative piece. And then I've got another book coming up next year, which is going to be back to basics and in helping to sort of teach people again on a slightly more wine course format.
Hmm.
But I'm not a creative writing kind of chap, really. I'm not a chronicler like James Halliday or Jancis Robinson. I'm not a creative writing genius like Andrew Jefford, for example.
Yeah.
I'm more of a holding the hand of the reader and taking them through the difficult subject, which is wine.
Okay. Um, with both I guess for lack of a better term, the day job, working
Mm,
in the trade, and then
yeah.
also with the various forms of communication, I'm sure you would have had lots of opportunities to travel. So you probably would have done a bit of circumnavigating of the globe as far as
Yeah.
wine is concerned.
Yeah, a few, but I have very large holes where I haven't been to, and it's purely driven by my own tastes. So
Okay.
while I'm supposed to be globally, a wine expert, whatever that means, as far as my readers are concerned, and I taste wines from everywhere, I only generally travel to places where I personally love the wines.
Okay.
So um, because there's only so much time in the day, it's a hell of a schedule. The wine circuit, as you know, with events every single day and tastings every single day, to just to get the time to tear yourself away from the tasting bench or the laptop is difficult. So when I go abroad, I've got to make it count, and that's why I see you in Australia. I go to New Zealand and I go to South Africa
Mm-hmm.
less
So
frequently, and
Southern
then
Hemisphere trip.
yeah, clearly sort of blanket bomb Europe pretty intensively. But I don't. I've only been to Germany a few times in my life. I find I can taste most of their great wines in the UK. I love going to Spain, Portugal, Italy, France. Really, that would be my focus. I vet so by mission, the places I really don't go to are North America and South America. In fact, I've never been to Chile or Argentina.
Is that a little bit determined by the wines that are actually available in the UK at all? And the sort of the
A little
wines that
bit.
might be submitted with your job, but also as a communicator?
Yeah. But it's a little bit to do with clearly if a wine isn't sold in the UK, it's slightly less important to me. Obviously, it's important, in a sort of informing my palate sort of way.
Yeah,
But if it's not sold in the UK, then I can't use it in my work.
of
And
course.
you've got to remember that I sell my knowledge. It's quite simple, and that's why I taste so many wines to try to find the best wines available, and then I sell that information in the Daily Mail and in Money Week, and so it's important to find the right wines. Um, with regard to South America, say Chile and Argentina, the wines don't appeal to me as much as those from Australia and New Zealand, simply because, and you'll have experienced this many times, I'm sure. Um, just sheer winemaking skill and balance and oak and alcohol and extraction and those obvious things. The wines made in Australia and New Zealand are finer, much, much, much finer in general terms, and that appeals to me more. And so I'm not going to, given the opportunity to write up a beautiful Aussie Shiraz versus a slightly more rustic Chilean Syrah, the
Mm.
Aussie wins. I've only got one slot.
Uh, in my experience, I have been fortunate enough to do a bit of traveling in South America.
Yeah.
My impression was that wines taste a little bit too similar. There's just not enough
Yeah.
diversity. You
Yeah.
go to Mendoza, and the Malbecs all taste very similar.
Yeah.
The
Well, they're
the, the
large properties, aren't there?
yeah,
That's one of the
exactly.
sort of dominant
Really,
properties.
when you consider that
That's true.
Mendoza alone produces, I think, 30% more wine than all of Australia,
Yeah.
you sort of you kind of really just scratching the surface about how huge the industry is
Yeah.
there.
So I,
Um,
I would imagine if I lived in Argentina and was an Argentinian wine writer, clearly I'd be out there doing every single property I could find. But given the choice of the whole world to feature, they don't kind of figure in my write-ups as often as perhaps they'd like.
Absolutely. So you're obviously very famous for your love of Australian wines,
Quite right.
and I don't think anyone would argue that you're possibly one of the most influential communicators on Australian wine in the UK. How did you initially come to have that kind of personal relationship connection with Australian wine?
It happened on day one. Head right back to '87 and the
Right.
lovely Barnes wine shop, and the wines on the Aussie wines on the shelf there. I remember where they were sitting, just on the open the front door on the left hand side, top two shelves,
Mm-hmm.
um, were all the the big brands, the famous names we still have today,
Sure.
and they tasted fantastic. I
Yeah.
mean, really great, and they were all fantastic value. And back then, much more so than now, the winemakers and the principals of those famous estates would travel to the UK,
Sure.
and
Uh,
they'd come over 2 or 3 times a year, pour their wines at wine fairs and tastings and events. They'd come to the shop, open up, weird and wonderful bottles. And I was absolutely transfixed.
mm,
And that was way ahead of the Kiwis. It was way ahead of the South Africans. The French have never done it.
sure.
The Europeans don't do it. They expect you to visit them.
Yeah.
And so the engagement and the flow of information, there were no secrets. Aussies didn't hide anything. They didn't say, oh, we can't possibly tell you that. It's a family kind of, thing. It's why we are better than our neighbors. There was none of that. It was, we do this. This is why it tastes great. And I just thought, I love this. I understand this. Is speaking my language. And obviously the wines have become far more sophisticated and there's far more choice these days. But the message is the same. It's great people making great wines.
Is something that appeals to you the accessibility of the wines, whether it's in terms of the actual people who are making them. Obviously, you're saying that they're very open and friendly,
Yeah.
engaging, but also the accessibility in terms of the style of the wines, the
Precocity, I think
clear
that,
labeling.
yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that many of the wines are quite forward drinking, but there's a caveat there, and this is something I impress on my readers enormously, and that is that while the wines taste flattering in their youth,
Yeah,
they still have extraordinary ability to age. And that's something we don't see in the UK very much because we don't generally keep Aussie wines. We don't sell our Aussie wines as we would like French wines, let's say.
well,
It's
you're not
just a
the
sort
only
of
ones.
yeah. No, it's a problem because when I'm lucky enough to taste old Australian wine, so generally in Australia in restaurants or with people who've got decent collections,
Yeah,
um, the wines show absolutely extraordinary balance for almost twice as long as I'd expect them to live for, and they don't tend to have this rather short sort of firework life like the equivalent, let's say, French wine, yeah, which
sure.
would get up to its peak and then die. There's a very, very smooth curve with some of the sort of medium priced Aussie Cabernets or Shiraz Cab blends that really look amazing and evolve amazingly. And this I think it's fruit integrity
Hmm.
and perhaps quite long growing season and often coolish nights, so particular regions lend themselves to this, have uh, entranced my palate since day one. And that's one of the main messages I'm taking to my readers over here, which is if you are going to invest in wine, in a small way or a big way, don't leave Australian red wines and even white wines. I mean, look at the aging curve of top Aussie Chardonnay versus white Burgundy. Blimey,
Mm.
white Burgundy is now, and I had a lunch the other day with a few people, and they were all saying, "Why is my white Burgundy falling over?"
Well,
You know,
yeah, there's been a lot of talk
there's a
here in
lot of talk about
Australia
that.
about like a lot of the '90s
Yeah,
burgundies, the
well,
white
and
burgundies
some of
just
the
falling
early,
over, and
yeah, and
what's
the
about
early noughties. And then I'll open up a 15-year-old Aussie Chardonnay, and it looks great. The color is white and the
mm.
nose is developed, but there's no premature oxidation. The oak's perfectly in balance, and it's underpinned with great acidity. Amazing.
It's interesting. I've recently been pulling out a few, not super old. We're talking sort of mid 2000s out of my
Yeah,
cellar locally, but they're all pretty much under screw cap, and I'm
yeah,
finding that they're still looking extraordinarily fresh and youthful,
yeah.
and really still not opening up after 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I see the same thing. And this is, to Australia's credit, it really is a bee in the bonnet of the Burgundians. I'm telling you.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
some of them are bottling under screw cap, quite serious vineyards, and there are premier crues under screw cap because they've gone beyond being fascinated with this style of closure. They're now actually doing it themselves, some of these people. So it's only going to help, I think. But it's not just a closure issue; it's also a winemaking issue, and they're taking a leaf out of the Aussie book. A lot of the young growers in, the sort of children of Burgundy have worked in Australia.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you go out to a winery here in Australia during the harvest period, and you'll easily find young still students or just finished their
Yeah.
studies who from France, Italy,
And
Portugal,
the funny thing
sometimes
is,
Germany.
if you know their surnames, if you can find out their surname, not just their Christian name, yeah,
Mm.
and you know your Burgundies, will go, I know where you're from.
Well, there's one really well-known example whose estate is in Beaujolais and is a kind of a cult winery, and so he
Yeah,
gets paraded around by a lot of the hipster somms who are into their natural wines. So it's really funny to see him
there you go.
around and about. When did you actually had you been to Australia before you started working with wine?
No, absolutely not. The first time I came out was in 1999.
Okay, and did you just sort of having had some experience with the wines and meeting some of the people behind the wines over in London, was that kind of just a confirmation of what you felt was
Yeah.
Australian wine?
It kind of took it to another level. I know this sounds a bit sad, but prior to coming to Australia for the first time, I could not understand. I wasn't quick enough with the sort of which regions are in which state.
Yeah,
You know,
sure,
the map of Australia. It's the same as when you travel anywhere in the world.
of course.
And by going there, it cements it in your mind. But imagine this: getting off a plane, my first ever visit, getting off a plane in Perth and driving down to Margaret River, and the first visit that I had was with David Honan at Cape Mentelle,
Oh goodness.
and I just looked around myself and thought, oh my god, this is why. I remember the 1984 Cabernet,
Yep.
um, and
Was that a
drinking
Jimmy
that.
Watson Trophy winner?
Um,
Was that late 70s?
do you know what? I think it might be, but I can't remember. But it
Yeah.
was one of the wines that I tasted early on in my career,
Yeah.
and he served it again. When I arrived for dinner or something like that,
Yeah.
and I said, I know this wine. I know this wine well. I've had this wine a few times before, and being here makes sense.
Wow.
Having it in England was impressive and exciting, but it didn't make sense to me. How could this wine have been made? What was going on?
Sure.
And then sitting, in Margaret River itself, having had a little swim on Prevelly Beach and
Yeah.
going to the Arc of Iris and, having to bring a chair because they didn't have enough chairs in the restaurant to cope with our table and just all the crazy things that happened back then. Drinking that wine, it was suddenly a eureka moment and that was it. I was done.
Yeah. Just immediately
Yeah.
contextualized everything that you knew
Yeah,
about the
it was
wine.
amazing, and I think about it a lot. I think about these moments a lot. They still happen today, thank God.
Hmm.
And that's what keeps me excited. But yeah, that was one of the first things. And David, when I see him, now I see him every so often. We kind of know that that's what happened. It's quite a lovely thing.
Mm. Of course, the real hub of wine in Australia, certainly the state that produces the most is South Australia, and Adelaide, is sort of the unofficial, maybe it is the official home of Australian wine.
Yeah,
And that was sort of where I believe you kind of stumbled upon the idea because you're a very charitable kind of person, and that was sort of where you came up with the original idea of a way of connecting several of your passions to come up with this great event. Can you tell me a bit about the story of how you came
yeah.
up with the
It's
concept?
it's kind of it's a pretty simple story. It's a pretty easy story to understand. Whenever you land in Australia, if you're flying from the UK, generally land pretty early in the morning.
Yeah.
And so flying into Adelaide and landing at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and not being able to check into your hotel until lunchtime.
Mm-hmm.
There's not an awful lot to do. So it was always a sort of jet lag kind of cure thing for me, would be to dump my bags at the hotel and then go for a walk.
Sure.
Not least because I'm classic Boy Scout. I like to know the lay of the land and the map of the city and mainly where the bars are for later on. And so, as you know, when in Adelaide's peculiar kind of city and its shape, being a sort of square,
Yeah.
and then surrounded with parkland around that square. No matter which way you turn, you end up in parkland.
Yeah.
And I thought this is beautiful. Really, really, really stunning. I really was taken by the city itself. But if you just walk into the parklands, the first thing you see is loads of homeless people, all sleeping rough. And I just couldn't believe it for such a sort of affluent feeling market town kind of, Adelaide is quite a sort of wealthy place.
Yeah.
There seemed to be a disproportionate number of homeless people.
Yeah.
So I'd been trying to figure a way of doing some sort of giving back something to Australia for being so generous with their time and wines, like to teach me about wine. I thought I'd come up with some sort of concept to raise some money for homelessness because that clearly was a problem. And I love rugby massively. Used to play a lot of rugby at school and university. And then I love, obviously, wine and food. And so I thought I'd put together a little annual tournament.
Yeah.
And you guys are quite into touch footy out here, or touch rugby, as we call it. We don't really play it as a social sport anywhere near as much as you guys do.
Yeah.
And so when I was told that generally the teams are mixed, girls and boys, over here we play very little mixed sport at all. And so it was a perfect kind of solution to a problem. It turned out that the fundraising boss of Hutt Street, which is the homeless refuge in Adelaide,
Yeah.
on Hutt Street itself, was in the same footy team as one of my mates who works for a winery. So it was just so easy. It was on a plate, and I met up with her. And this is another one of those wine moments. Yeah, I met up with her early on a Sunday morning before my meeting started, before my tasting started. I was staying at the Hilton, and I walked across to Hutt Street and went to a pub on the corner, very near to her. I think it's called the Havelock Tavern, and we drank a bottle of Sunday morning Pinot Gris on Sunday morning. That red bank wine, which back then was delicious, and I discussed my plans, and she said, "Brilliant, bring it on." And in the first year, we managed to get 24 teams or 24 wineries to play against each other.
Yeah.
We managed to get Nick Farr-Jones to fly over from Sydney to come and be a celebrity.
Oh wow!
And then that was 10 years ago or something. And the event just got bigger and bigger and bigger every year until we had 48 teams playing, so 48 wineries showing their wines off, and 3,000 odd people coming down to the parklands and getting, pulling hamstrings and having a load of wine. It was fantastic.
Well, certainly,
So,
sport and then wine and food are probably two of the most community oriented activities there are. So yeah, absolutely makes perfect sense.
So then I took the idea over to Melbourne, met up with the people at St Mary's House of Welcome, and sort of photocopied the idea. And we've done it for the last 3 years in Melbourne. It's been incredibly successful.
Mm-hmm.
And this year, so coming up in 10 days time or whatever, I'm getting on the plane on Sunday. Yes, 10 days time. We've taken a little bit of a change of tack because St Mary's is under a little bit of pressure. They've lost a lot of funding from the government. Unfortunately, a big check is missing from their donations. And so rather than committing an awful lot of time from the Zoe basically does all the fundraising there. She works tirelessly to organise the Wine Rules event each year. We've just said, let's not play footy this year. It takes up too much time. Let's do a completely different event and hold it in the actual St Mary's building.
Yeah.
And bring a whole load of locals down, and we'll do a big food and wine matching masterclass. Involving the wineries who normally come along and play footy. They can just submit some wine. I'll taste it, write some notes for them, which is the quid pro quo that I've agreed with them. And we get a whole load of bodies down. Everyone can have a fantastic food and wine evening involving the local restaurants in the sort of Fitzroy ward. And and hopefully we'll raise a fairly big amount of money without having to work so many man hours getting it ready.
Yeah. Well, I know it's something that I'm really looking forward to getting involved with, and obviously looking
Well,
forward to catching up with you.
we've really appreciated your support, James, over the last few years as well, because spreading the word is one of the things that is difficult for me to do from London, and really does rely on you guys to help out. So I'm always very grateful for your help.
Well, I do appreciate your time in chatting with me today, and like I said, looking forward to seeing you when you are down in just over 10 days.
Yeah.
So I'm now going to switch over, and I'm going to
All
talk
right.
to Zoe Lake, who is from St Mary's House of Welcome, and she's going to talk a little bit about St Mary's and what we've got coming up. So
Very good.
safe trip here.
Yeah. Cheers, mate.
Hopefully the weather improves in London, and see you soon.
All right. Toodaloo.
Zoe, tell us a little bit about the background of St Mary's.
Well, St Mary's was started by an order of nuns called the Daughters of Charity in the 1950s. They had a convent near our present location, and they saw a great need for food for men sleeping rough in the parks of Collingwood and Fitzroy. So these women took sandwiches across the road to the parks and fed these men, who then started turning up on their doorstep and saying, "We hear you've got some food available." And from there, a soup kitchen was born. They very quickly outgrew the space that they had available and needed larger premises. So they set up in Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, and they've been in that location since the 1960s. And the centre has evolved from being basically a drop-in place and a soup kitchen to being a full mental health service, a place where people can have a hot meal, showers, receive emergency relief if they need clothing, help with medication, referrals for housing and things like that, as well as activities, social support, and access to services like Centrelink and legal aid and so on. So that's where St Mary's is these days.
And are generally the people who are making use of all those wonderful services the same people as they were originally being looked after by the nuns?
I think, look, I'm not sure about the statistics of what kind of people were accessing the services in the 50s, but I can tell you about the kind of people who come to us now. Okay. About maybe 10% of the people who come to St Mary's are sleeping rough. Another 10 to 15% or so are considered homeless in that they don't have their own roof over their heads, but they're couch surfing, lobbing with friends, outstaying a welcome of too many weeks with a family member, moving to another family member's house, that kind of thing. So their accommodation is very unstable. Another 20% or so are living in boarding houses nearby, and a lot of those boarding houses are really inadequate. They are not necessarily particularly clean. They might not have a room to themselves. A lot of the places don't have nice or really any bathrooms. They might have toilets and sinks, but no shower facilities. So people who live in boarding houses come to us for access to showers and things like that. And then the remaining sort of 50% or so of people who come to St Mary's are housed probably in public housing. A lot of them live nearby in the Brunswick Street apartments and local suburbs. So they are in a situation where they're housed and their housing is permanent, but they're always just on the edge of homelessness. And they still will need a lot of social support. A lot of the people who come to St Mary's have mental illness problems, alcohol and other drug problems, and a lot of people are very alone. So even if they are nicely housed and have a Centrelink income that is able to support them, it's just enough. Maybe they can afford meals, but they come to St Mary's because they're lonely and they're seeking some social support. And St Mary's can provide a very safe place for them to be, access to friendship and someone to share a meal with.
So absolutely, it's community minded, even within the walls of St Mary's, but also there is a need to be connected to the community. So Fitzroy, where Brunswick Street is, certainly has had a an interesting history. You know, they still have housing commission flats. It was very, very working class.
Yeah.
Sort of up until about, I think, 20, 25 years ago. It's changed a little bit more since then, but still, there was a sort of I think in several periods of time there were big migrant movements within the neighbourhood. So,
and even now there's a large migrant population. We have quite a large Vietnamese group, particularly being so close to Victoria Street, where there's a lot of the big Vietnamese community there. We have quite a large number of Vietnamese migrants who come to us seeking social support. And in terms of mental illness in the migrant community, you see an increase in some illnesses like schizophrenia.
Sure.
And I think because of the trauma of the situation in their home countries, the reasons for which they came to Australia and decided to uproot their families and leave, becoming a refugee it's stressful and can lead to a lot of mental illness. So we have quite a few service users who come to us with fairly severe mental illnesses, including schizophrenia in the Vietnamese and migrant communities. We also have a contingent of Mandarin-speaking people who come to St Mary's, and all of them are quite elderly. Now, we're only funded to support people who are up to the age of 65, and then beyond the age of 65, they actually fall into an aged population, which is a different level of funding. So we have a group of about 12 people who are all over 80 who are Mandarin speakers who come to us, and we received a grant for a social worker, Mandarin speaking social worker, to look after that group. They've got their own little cultural activities and they make the most amazing dumplings. They are delicious.
Now, funding obviously something that Matthew touched upon. Just give us an idea about the unfortunate circumstances that St Mary's is in at the moment.
So until the end of July, St Mary's had been receiving funding from essentially three main buckets. About $500,000 for mental health funding, and we were funded to provide structured mental health programs for about 109 registered participants. And those included activities like outings, craft, choir, and other things that were, in addition to casework, ways to keep people connected to their community and give them an outlet for socialisation, I guess. It helps with their mental health. So that was about $500,000 of funding. About $500,000 comes from the government for homelessness support. And then another $500,000 or so is raised by me and my team through fundraising. So trusts and foundations, events, our very successful winter appeal, Christmas appeal, and other activities that we do. So after the 31st of July, St Mary's has had a devastating cut to the funding, and we lost all of our mental health funding. There is a small amount remaining through till early next year, but essentially we've lost $500,000 of funding in the mental health reform, and that means that we've had to cancel a whole lot of programs which our service users really enjoyed, and the way that we provide care to these people has changed a lot. So it's a 3-year funding model, and we hope that the government will see at the end of that time, preferably before that time, that the people who come to St Mary's don't just need an hour and a half a fortnight with a caseworker, which is what they're now receiving under the new model, but they need a support network and people to call friends, and this sort of, the government doesn't like the word day centre, but really that's what they want, that's what they need. They want a place that they can come to and be safe and treat like their own homes if they don't have a home that's like that.
So with that removal of a really hefty proportion of funding, unfortunately has meant that St Mary's has had to really try and ramp up as much as possible the fundraising of its own, and certainly the wine rules in the last few years has done a really fantastic job to raise money for the charity, but moving forward, certainly it was something that we'd talked about, even though rugby and touch footy is a very Australian activity. It's not as popular in Melbourne, so it's sort of, even though people were really getting involved and the wineries were very, very gracious of their time and involvement, I think it was sort of difficult to get a lot of interest from just the general public, and so I think that was kind of why you and Matthew came up with a slightly revised concept for November, and then sort of how to, I guess, relaunch the wine rules into the future. So what I know Matthew talked a little bit about it, but what is happening this month with Matthew coming to Australia?
Well, I set Matthew the challenge, I guess, of redesigning wine rules in a way that means we can bring it back to Fitzroy, because wine rules as a sporting event is a lot of fun, but there's just not enough space in Fitzroy, being quite a high density area, for us to do that event in our neighbourhood. We were doing it down at Elwood Park, which is a great venue, but it's quite far from St Mary's, which is a very Fitzroy based service. So,
and the community being such an intrinsic part of St Mary's, I think that was kind of why you felt that it was being somewhat removed from the community.
Yeah. Another reason is that we do all these fundraising events off-site, and we want our donors and supporters and friends to be able to see inside St Mary's. So
in the same way that Matthew was just talking about how he, when he first visited Margaret River, his first visit to Australia, and the wines that he'd tasted in the past, suddenly they contextualized so much more because he was actually in the place they were from. It's the same thing with this, the people who are supporting the charity, it's such a fantastic experience for them to actually see the influence they're going to be having.
It is. And even though our service users won't be there on the night, a chance to show our donors and friends and supporters inside St Mary's, I think I don't know what people think before they come to St Mary's, but when they do see the place, I think they get it, and they get what we're about. And our CEO, Tony, tells a story about the day that we opened the new building. It was renovated 5 years ago from being a dingy little rabbit warren of lots of small connected rooms from the 1950s through to 2009. And then it was renovated to this beautiful open glass space with a fantastic courtyard that our service users can treat like their own backyard, and a pool room and a computer room and all these great spaces. And Tony said that they opened the building to a few long-term service users to see before it was open to the public. And they walked into the building for the first time. And when you enter the building, at certain times of day, the sun comes through the glass into reception, and it's just, the whole place is so light and bright and open. And they looked out the windows into the courtyard and they said, is this place for us? And they couldn't believe that people would build a building so beautiful for them. They didn't think that it was for them, and they couldn't believe it, and they appreciated the support. So I think bringing our supporters into our space is a really important part of going forward with St Mary's, and really inviting our supporters to come and see the work that we do.
So what is the event going to entail?
So the event that Matthew has devised is really a brilliant way for us to maintain the great relationships that we've made through wine rules with Victorian wineries. So Matthew's concept was to run a masterclass for up to 150 guests on our premises, so that they could see St Mary's, but also taste some food and wine matches that Matthew will put together. So we've invited wineries that we know to submit their most exciting wines, either something that is new and experimental for them, something that they want to push to the market because they're excited about it, something that's a bit special, but the key is that it needs to be available to buy right now.
Okay.
There's nothing more frustrating for a consumer than tasting a really amazing wine that you can't buy and you can't have it. Why,
when Matthew's writing about wines for the UK, the wines have to be available in that market too. And obviously there's going to be a food element
match
as well.
So we're going to, Matthew will choose his 10 wines that work best to the theme that he wants to talk about, and he'll decide the theme when he tastes the wine. So he'll pick 10 and match those to 10 canapes donated by local restaurants that are friends of St Mary's, and he'll talk about the wine and its winemaking style and where it's from and why this wine is delicious or special or exciting in whichever way he wants to call out, and also why those flavours of that wine work so well with the food that he's matched it to.
So what, apart from people coming along, what's the date of the reminder?
Saturday, 15th of November.
15th of November, so it's not too far away, and it's an evening?
Yes. So the masterclass will go from 6 till 8:30 with 10 wine and food tastes. Then we'll have a plate of food and a chance to try the other wines that have been submitted for Matthew's review. Probably another 20 wines or so will be available for tasting. And wines will be available by the glass after the masterclass, and we invite guests to experience St Mary's and have a chat and have a great night. So
at this stage, we are really hoping for people to find out more and buy some tickets and come and attend. But
absolutely.
We're also looking for some more local, community restaurant involvement. So for any listeners out there in any way involved with a restaurant in Fitzroy, Collingwood, Carlton, anywhere in that inner north area who would love to be involved, all we do ask is, I think is
150 canapes of your signature dish.
In the same way that Matt's asked the wineries to select something that they're excited about, maybe a signature kind of canapé or something that you're excited about to send out of the kitchen, and that obviously would be a really fantastic way for the people who are coming along to have the connection with the community, not just obviously with St Mary's and the Victorian wineries, but also the other local restaurants.
Yeah, each of the guests will receive a little booklet detailing the Matthew's review of the wine, talking about where to buy that wine, the website, retail price, and also any of the restaurants who donate, their restaurant will be described as well. And we are strongly encouraging our guests to buy their wine from those wineries for the Christmas period, and also to book events at those restaurants.
Absolutely. So how can people find out more about the event and about St Mary's?
Sure. We have an event website, which is www.winerules.com.au. So that's winerules, WINERULES. And my phone number and email address are both on that website. And you can also view a list of the wines that we've had submitted for tasting review so far.
And in terms of social media, is there a Twitter account or a hashtag you'd like people to use?
You can follow Wine Rules on Twitter. It's at wine_rules. And we also have a Facebook page, which is wine.rules.smhow, which is St Mary's House of Welcome.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Zoe.
James.
And obviously thank you to Matthew. Matthew can be found on social media, of course. He's got a bit of a following. So I think he's Matthew W. Jukes.
Matthew S. Jukes.
Matthew S. Jukes, sorry. And on Instagram as well, just Matthew Jukes. Do definitely go to his website, which is matthewjukes.com. That's got lots and lots of information. He's writing for the website. It's got links to articles, to books, events, and
sign up to his blog.
Absolutely, because he is really a very, very fascinating person to be following. But thank you both for coming on the Vincast. Guys, as always, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at IntrepidWino. Please do come and visit me at my website, intrepidwino.com. For the Vincast, you can listen to episodes and download them on the website, but I do encourage everyone to subscribe and download episodes on either iTunes or Stitcher. Whilst you're there, would really love for you guys to rate and review, comments, share. Really looking forward to hearing from people, ideas about topics or possible guests. But until next time, bye.